Here's a question for you. What happens to underground trains when they reach the end of their careers? I actually encountered an article on this subject a couple of weeks ago, which really did not answer the question and frankly wasn't very good. So I thought that rather than carp about someone else's work, I'd give you my own take on the subject. Trains are quite substantial things, so they can often have a long life. A 20-year-old train is a spring chicken. An 80 or 90-year-old train might still have some life left in it. Now obviously most of them eventually do go to the scrapyard, and a handful make it to heritage railways and museums, but they'll often have a convoluted journey to get there. What initially happens is that trains are cascaded down. That is to say, when a train gets out of date, TfL or its predecessors might move it down to a less intensive service. The Bakerloo Line's 1972 stock was originally ordered for the Northern Line, for instance. Now this can't always be done because different lines have different requirements. Piccadilly Line trains can only really work on the Piccadilly Line, and that's why the intensively worked Piccadilly Line still uses 1973 stock, and why that's top priority for replacement. The Metropolitan Railway A-class steam locomotive in the London Transport Museum is an example of a locomotive that survived by being cascaded down. It was built in 1866 to work what's now the Metropolitan line between Paddington and the City of London. The design was a good one, and it was used by several other railway companies. In fact, the A-class and the follow-up, the B-class, I don't know if you've spotted the naming pattern here, were kept on the same job until the 1900s when the central London section of the Metropolitan Railway was electrified. But by that stage, the Metropolitan Railway ran a long way out of London. Two of the redundant A-class, numbers 23 and 41, were sent out to the Brill branch. This was about as different from a tube line as you could imagine. A typical train consisted of a single coach and maybe a couple of goods wagons. In 1933, the Metropolitan Railway was taken over by London Transport and officially became an underground line. London Underground was run by people who'd cut their teeth on busy commuter lines like the Piccadilly Tube and the City and South London Railway, and they had zero interest in some light railway out in the wilds of Buckinghamshire. So in 1935 they closed the Brill branch and number 23 was given a new duty. It was transferred to departmental stock. Railway rolling stock tends to be classed as revenue earning or departmental. Revenue earning is the stuff that you, the passenger, or you, the customer who wishes to transport freight, uses every day. Departmental stock consists of trains that don't bring money in for the railway but are necessary to keep things going. In the case of number 23, it was used for shunting rolling stock at Neasden Depot and did so until 1948. By that time it was over 80 years old and a bona fide historical artifact, so it was preserved. It's kind of remarkable that a mid-Victorian locomotive was still at work within living memory, but it happened surprisingly often, much to the delight of the aforementioned heritage railways and museums. Departmental stock took many forms. Shunting was perhaps the most common, with motor coaches that couldn't keep up with modern services often being turned into what are known as pilot motors or ballast motors, vehicles that shunt rolling stock around the depot. In some cases, ballast motors were Frankensteined together from parts of withdrawn vehicles. This one, preserved at Epping Signal Cabin, consists of parts from at least 3 different carriages. Other duties included leaf clearing, track monitoring, tunnel cleaning, and de-icing. This Sleet locomotive at the Museum Depot in Acton was used for de-icing conductor rails, constructed from a pair of 1903 Central London Railway cars. As such, it's the closest thing we have to a surviving Central London Railway train. This Metropolitan Railway T-stock coach at Buckinghamshire Railway Centre is another former de-icer. If the Underground had no further use for a train, someone else might. It's worth noting that in the 19th century there wasn't really much functional difference between the rolling stock used on the subsurface lines of the Underground and the rolling stock used everywhere else. So this was often sold to light railways, industrial railways, or less intensively worked railways. Some coaches even ended up in France, like this one. The Cambrian Railways in Wales bought a few locomotives and somewhat experimentally converted some into tender engines for greater range. Probably the most famous instance of tube trains being sold to another railway would be the ones on the Isle of Wight. The Ryde Tunnel is too low for standard modern rolling stock, and the original plan for the railways of the Isle of Wight was simply to close them all. The compromise British Rail reached was to electrify the line from Ryde Pierhead to Shanklin and close the rest. To operate the remaining line, venerable standard stock trains of the 1920s were bought from London Transport in 1967. In 1992, these were replaced with 1938 stock trains. And in 2021, following some upgrade works, Class 484 trains were introduced. These are converted from D78 stock District Line trains of the 70s and 80s. The Class 484s were converted by Viva Rail, but these aren't the only Viva Rail conversions of District Line stock. The Class 230s are designed to work away from electrified lines, with some being diesel-electric, some being diesel-battery, and some being purely battery-powered. Following the closure of Viva Rail, the battery train project was bought out by Great Western Railway, who see it as a potential solution to the need to modernise short branch lines that will be considerably cheaper than full electrification. And even if a train is no use as a train, it might still find a use. Historically, old railway carriages were often sold off as cheap buildings. Some of them still survive as such, and some have even been converted back into railway carriages. These days, the novelty of having a tube train as your office or venue is a draw in itself. The Village Underground in Shoreditch is an office development that consists of a bunch of 1983 stock carriages on the part-demolished viaduct that once carried the North London Railway into Broad Street Station. At Walthamstow Pump House Museum, these 1967 Victoria Line coaches house a supper club, as well as their more obvious function as museum exhibits. In fact, it seems that for many tube carriages, their time being rammed full of rush-hour commuters through central London is only the start of their story. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this retiring tale from the tube. If so, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for their kind support. You are the de-icing equipment to my redundant carriage. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.